Okay. Ready to go. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting of the Woodstock Planning and Zoning Commission special meeting Tuesday, April 13th, 2023. Who's David? That's good.
Maybe not even nothing.
You don't normally visit with us, so we're right here, it's right in the box. You can sit wherever you
It can be anonymous if you
want.
want.
Get rabbits, so be on camera.
See what that's.
Yeah, that was the problem. Like to take a roll call. Tim Young, would you like to start us off? Tim Young, not really. Dean Gould,
Dave Morse.
Jeff Marcotte,
Joe Paloolik.
who we have online?
We have Doug Porter, and Dwight was with us, but we lost him.
Doug Porter's here.
Doug, you here?
Doug's Porter's here.
Gives the thumbs up.
About Dwight.
Can you ask them if they can still hear us?
Doug, can you still hear us?
I don't know if I'm turning it on or off.
Yeah,
What?
he gives the thumbs up.
Okay, well, I just don't know where. Can you say something so we can?
Can you say something to us, Doug, so we can test our audio?
Can you hear me? Yeah, yes or no? Can you hear me?
No, for the record that Joe Adaletta has joined us. It was pretty quiet. Well, till we get the audio figured out. We'll, seat the alternates, and unlike Dr. Gordon, I'm gonna let all the alternates sit. Because having the ones that don't get to sit stand up seems not right, so we do need them all. Okay. Dean and White. And we need everything, right? So. Any sound yet?
We have Dwight back.
Dwight's back. Dwight, you're here. Give us a thumbs up.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, sorry, having some technical difficulty tonight. Can you guys hear me okay?
We finally hear you. Doug,
Okay.
can you say something?
Can you guys hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Great.
That brings us to the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands
One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. That brings us to the chair's report. There is no chair's report, and brings us to agenda item 3, our annual legal training session with attorney Rich Roberts. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Nobody submitted any questions or suggestions about what they wanted me to talk about. So I'll just kind of cover a couple things briefly, and then maybe the rest of it will be whatever questions you might have, and we're not going to force anybody to make this last any longer than it needs to. It was funny because Dan and I were just talking about legislation that's pending, and because it's a long session of the legislature that goes till June, we just passed the point, or we're at the point where all the committees have done their work and sent their bills out to the to the House and the Senate to kind of sit and be looked at before any action is taken. And there's been a lot of discussion about potential consequences of some of the bills that have been proposed, but frankly, I think it's premature to even speculate as to what, if anything, is ultimately going get passed. I think the two that probably have generated the most enthusiasm in the zoning world are the transit oriented development ones. Where they're looking at either, depending on your perspective, either mandating or allowing certain more intensified developments within a certain distance of things like train stations, bus stations, ferry ports, that sort of thing. With the idea that, it would be easily accessible, apartment housing or multifamily housing for people who are going to be using mass transit, and it can cut down on the volume of cars and so forth. And at least the way some people are interpreting it applies to not just the towns that have those facilities in them, but the ones that are next to them. So, there are basically six or seven towns in the state that are outside of the scope of this, legislation. I think Union is outside of it. And 3 or 4 towns in the farthest northwest corner of the state are outside because, they don't have a train line or bus station or, anything like that. I'm guessing, Woodstock is probably included because it's 1 town away from 395 where,
We have Northeast Transit District and that's run through NECOG,
yeah,
but it's very limited. We don't have any bus stations.
right. Yeah, I mean, and back in the olden days, you used to be able to take the bus from Springfield to Providence and stand up and ring the bell and they'd let you off. Kind of by the Pink House, but I don't think that counts as transit-oriented development anymore. The other one that's out there that's gotten a lot of attention is, some people call it the fair share housing, where it's creating essentially a numerical requirement on the number of dwelling units that municipalities have to create or have to accommodate, and to have them provide a certain percentage of those, to be affordable. And I was listening to part of the public hearing on that, and one of the legislators who was opposed to it from the northeast part of the state was commenting that, his hometown has 1 or 2 building permits a year for new houses, and the plan calls for them to create 80 new, residential units. And it's like, who's going to do that? Where are they going to go? How's that going to work? So, again, I think it's one of those things where it might kind of bump into the reality of one size doesn't necessarily fit all, but that hasn't necessarily stopped the legislature from passing laws before. We're still trying to work our way through the accessory dwelling unit regulations, the outdoor dining, the cannabis and all the gifts that were left on our doorstep in 2021. Fortunately, there wasn't a whole lot last year other than kind of clarification and cleanup on things that had been passed the prior year. But it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the session this year and how to deal with it. I think a lot of the very substantive things were done in 2021 in terms of rewriting, the zoning enabling statutes to make a lot of the changes and to, get the accessory dwelling units in there to reduce the required amounts of parking for multifamily dwellings and so forth. So there are just a lot of things that got done that, that everybody's still kind of grappling with. There haven't been any truly fascinating legal cases either, at least not ones that are tremendously relevant to Woodstock. There was one, I think it was Fairfield, and one of the questions that had always been kind of out there was the question of putting time limits on special permit approvals. Could you do that? Could they expire? Or did they run with the land? And I think one of the reasons why it doesn't necessarily apply too much here is that you don't have the separate site plan approvals that have the 5-year timeframes to them that were the kind of the mechanisms by which people were claiming that special permits would expire at some point in time. But I think the general consensus now is that by and large, if you grant someone a special permit, it runs with the land, it doesn't expire necessarily. If there are, particularly if there is work that needs to be done to carry out the purpose of special permit. So, for example, hypothetically, you allowed drive-through restaurants by special permit, and somebody came in and they wanted to put a Dunkin' Donuts on 169 with a drive-through through it, and they would have a site plan that shows what they were doing and what they were building and so forth, and that would go with the special permit. In the past, there were people who would say that, well, the special permit only has the site plan only has a 5-year lifespan. So if they haven't built it by then, it expires and goes away, and the special permit is no more. Now it's kind of not so simple, but I think it's more something to keep in mind when you're granting special permit approvals, particularly if it's for a use that doesn't require construction of a new facility, that you should treat it as if it runs with the land forever, the way other land use approvals do.
Just using that same example, if there's a special permit issued for a bank with a drive-through teller. The bank closes, goes somewhere else, the building's still available, and a donut shop comes in. It's a different line of business. Is it still, is the donut business allowable under the existing special permit, or does the donut shop have to come in for its own special permit, since it's a different use of the land?
I would say that your regulations should probably say it's a different use of the land and would require its own special permit, even though, the facility was there, because it was approved, as, the permitted special permit use is bank with drive-through, not building with drive-through.
So our regulations need to say something like that,
Yeah, I would make sure that they're explicit on what the uses are that are being permitted, just so you don't kind of get, boomeranged into something that you don't want.
So then our wording on our special permits needs to be very specific too then.
Well, I think you want to, well, that's definitely the case, but I think you'd also want to make it clear in the regulations that, a special permit use is X. But I do agree that, you want to kind of cover all the bases in the special permit language, in terms of conditions or stipulations, just to make sure that, it's something that you can live with when the current owner sells to somebody else, or, slightly different use under the same general category goes in at a later date.
So I have a question for you. The current regulations are kind of residential versus non-residential.
Yeah.
And the list of special permitted uses does have many things on the list, but it still lumps a lot of things into a few categories. So do you think there should be more uses listed to be more specific and make them individual instead of grouping them together?
I think one thing you might want to look at is particular uses that have characteristics that you may want to have additional criteria associated with. You know, some towns go overboard, I mean, and they have, you know, they have the general special permit criteria and some generic things. You know, but they might have 25 or 30 separate additional special permit sections for, you know, nursing homes, horse stables, wineries, wedding venues, you know, auto repair, you know, each of which has its own kind of subset of additional conditions and criteria that have to be met. So, you know, I wouldn't advocate cutting and pasting everything conceivable, but if there are things that you are anticipating or concerned about, you might want to look at having basically additional performance standards or criteria for certain types of.
What we have is standards, and then what we call criteria is how an application is evaluated. Do you mean to have standards for each one of these things?
Additional standards, yeah.
Standard.
Yeah, I mean, the other night I was in a town where the application was for a wedding event venue. And it was allowed in a particular zone by special permit. And they had the general special permit criteria about, you know, harmony with the neighborhood and property values and health and safety and adequate roads and that sort of thing. But there were, I don't know, probably 11 or 12 specific additional criteria, you know, some of which maybe were a little too restrictive or too tailored. Like it had to be on a property with at least 25 acres.
So that would be a standard, right?
Yeah, it had to be on a property of 25 acres. You know, it couldn't operate outside of certain hours. You know, there were limits on, you know, any kind of outdoor activities and music. You know, as well as, you know, some enhanced standards regarding, you know, road access and driveways and sightlines and so forth. You know, that were tied to that particular use. And right before that, there was one for like riding stables, and it wasn't as many additional criteria, but it had some in there about, you know, things like required acreage and, you know, how far from the property lines the barns and the riding rings could be and where the parking had to go and that sort of stuff. So, you know, if you're bored and looking for things to add to your zoning regulations, you know, or seriously, if you are, you know, if you have something that it's like, wow, this is getting out of hand and we don't want to let this happen again. You know, and it's, you know, either reasonably foreseeable or likely that it will happen again, maybe want to establish the criteria so that next time you have kind of a better confines around that proposed use.
You seem to be making a point about talking about a standard versus criteria.
I didn't bring my regulations with me for like the first time in like 16 years of having here, but in our special permit regulations, we have the stuff you have to submit with your application.
Yeah.
And in your uses, that's where you have your standards, like your lot size and your setback and your, all the other stuff. But in our section on evaluating an application, we call that criteria. So it's making it, trying to make it clear what he was talking about, because criteria, I didn't know if you meant how you evaluate an application is different based on the kind of application versus what standards you apply. So like not special for residential, we have a list of things like your minimum lot size is 2.5 acres, and there's stuff in there about driveways and interior lots and stuff like that. Those are standards that apply to that use. And then we have a section called non-residential uses. And it's it's not broken down by, you know, say restaurants versus retail stores. It's all non-residential applies to that section. And those are the standards that apply, the building size, like was it 10,000 square feet or something, and then you can have 5,000 square feet of a different use on the same property. So that's a standard. But
So-
since
so
we
you
use the
just-
word criteria in a different place,
Right,
about how to evaluate the application, there's a list of, I don't know, 15 things or something. So I wanted to make sure I knew and the commission understood what he was talking about.
so it sounds like we'd be looking at trying to either optimize the standards rather than the criteria. If we
It
wanted
sounds
to
like
do
he's
what.
saying creating more lists of specialized standards based on different, not lumping them all into under the umbrella of non-residential. Right now, we have residential and non-residential.
Okay,
There's
yeah,
only
I think
two
I got that,
umbrellas.
right.
I think he's
Okay.
saying there's more umbrellas, so you might
Right.
have a set of standards for retail use, set of standards for restaurants or something as an example.
Yeah, I mean, things like parking would be different for a restaurant from a factory, from a crematorium.
So what we have is we have non-residential, which is mostly about building size, and then we have townwide. And that's, again, not broken down by the type of use. They have certain things that mostly only apply to non-residential. And some of that stuff applies to residential, but for instance, lighting is in that section, and that doesn't apply to residential.
Yeah, I mean, so that would apply to every special permit use regardless of whether you had additional criteria associated with it.
Have a different set of standards based on your breaking down your, instead of having non-residential apply to everything that's not residential, you might have change that to have a different list based on maybe a few more categories.
Or
And
we should
then
just have more categories underneath non-residential.
you could, and then you could add a couple, like maybe you would keep the building size, but then maybe you'd have something specific to event venue or something if you want to talk about. Or agritourism, like the large scale, we've been hearing about farms that might want to have weddings. That's different from standard agriculture. So maybe there would be a section under, event venue or something, because they're not all gonna be at farms. We
Yeah.
had someone who was actually running one out of their barn and they don't have a permit for it. So, something like that.
Thank you.
All right. There was another case that was sort of amusing, that came down last week. It was from Westport, and the individual had applied to, it was on Route 1, and he had applied to cut down the trees and build an office building at some point back like 2004. And the application was, I think a little too intense. It got kind of argumentative with the commission, and then I guess in 2009, they applied again, for something basically the same, and it wasn't approved, and it was sort of poorly designed and so forth. And then maybe 2018, 2019, the same individual applied again, but the town staff told them, it's like, well, great, we got your application, but you're missing these 55 things, like, the traffic report, the drainage report, the engineer's report, the architectural renderings, just a whole bunch of things that were missing from the application. And on the day of the hearing, or the day before the hearing, the applicant's attorney mailed in a letter saying, here are some of the things which were, by and large, they were either things that had been submitted in the 2004 and 2009 applications, or kind of hastily compiled updates to those things, along with not applicable and so forth. So it was, sort of a last minute, data dump on town staff. And so they get to the public hearing, and the town staff says, we haven't had a chance to look at this. We recommend that you, continue the hearing to allow us to, to evaluate the stuff. We want the applicant to, consent to an extension to the opening of the hearing so that we can review this. the applicant refused to consent to an extension to the hearing, said, no, I want the, we want the hearing now. And the chairman, I guess, asked again, can we continue the hearing? And it's like, no, we want to do it now. At which point they basically talked among themselves and then closed the hearing without letting the applicant or his representative explain to them what it was they had submitted and why they thought it was adequate. So the hearing was closed, and then they had 2 more meetings to discuss the stuff. And some of the comments really aren't fit to be broadcast. Frankly, it was the first time I'd ever seen the word shit show in a legal decision. That was how the application was described. And so when they denied the application, they appealed, and long story short, the appellate court found that they had been denied any kind of fundamental due process ability to even, you can't even talk at your own public hearing because they don't want to listen to you. They close it, then have 2 meetings where they're, describing you and your applications in a parade of vulgarities. So they reversed the denial and sent it back for a hearing, which I'm sure will be a lot of fun. So Westport. Yeah, so that's rules to live by in terms of, even if you think the application is defective, don't go overboard to say how bad you think it is, and at least allow them to explain what it is that they've submitted.
So what would have been a better approach, to continue the public hearing, let the applicant talk about it, and then continue the public hearing? So that the commission could review all the data that they had just gotten the day before or something, and.
Yeah, I mean, I think anything where either the applicant or the commission was, particularly the applicant, was given the opportunity to talk. During the public hearing, I think that was, regardless of the outcome, that was probably the critical thing was, how can you even call it a fair public hearing if you don't allow the applicant or their representative to speak? Even if, they're the ones trying to rush you along,
Which is stupid move on their part. I mean, why would they want you to be rushed in your review?
Yeah.
But if that's what stupidity they want to do, then you can't stop them from being stupid.
Yeah.
But you can still provide them the opportunity to comment, and you can ask them questions and
Yeah, I mean, if it's,
identify a problem in their report, then you could say, I don't understand this, or why is this not included X, Y, and Z? And then they could sit there and stammer and whatever.
yeah, I mean, if it's incomplete or defective, at least let them try to convince you otherwise. Yeah, there was, we were talking about it at work, and there was one guy who remembered a situation, I think it was back in the 80s in West Haven, where somebody had come in and applied for something. And it was denied, and it was denied in a very ugly way. Because whatever was going on at the building that he wanted to change to something else was something that where the commission had approved, but he went and did something kind of different. And they resented that and made it clear to him that they resented that. And, there was a lot of vulgarity there too, and yelling, and it was denied. And, he appealed, saying that he wasn't given a fair hearing. The judge said, yeah, you're right, you didn't get a fair hearing. These 2 guys, basically started off with how much they hated you when they were never going to give you the permit you were looking for anyway, regardless of what you said, so that, they sent it back to the commission to have a hearing without those 2 members participating. Well, when it came back to the commission, those 2 members refused to leave and refused to not participate and got into an argument with the applicant's attorney and the town attorney at the same time. They finally did leave, in a parade of obscenities. And then the application was denied again. And this time, the appeal was coupled with a civil rights action claiming that his civil rights had been violated by the way he was being treated, and there was a substantial money judgment against town as a result of it.
Doesn't sound like they took part in the land use training session.
Yeah, right, or any kind of civility training.
Yeah,
Ethics training.
yeah. Are you ready for a question, or are you thinking of another example?
No, I don't have any more examples. The only other things that that Jeff suggested that I talk about were conflict of interest or freedom of information. But if you have live questions, I think I'd rather do that than, make stuff up.
I do have one, if you're ready. I was
Yeah.
wondering, if there's a zoning permit in our regulations, can we put conditions on a zoning permit? Much like we do for a special permit? If the applicant considers the use allowed by right based on our regulations. And it seemed like a zoning permit is appropriate. Can the commission still apply conditions for that zoning?
Actually, I think I might approach that same scenario from the other side by basically granting the zoning permit based on the fact that you're representing that you're doing A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, so that, you are relying on them identifying what it is that they're doing that is causing you to believe that it qualifies as a, permitted use as of right. And, if and when the applicant wants to go beyond scope of what they have talked about, at least there has to be a conversation with someone as to, whether that still falls within the same zoning permit, does the same analysis hold? Yeah, I mean, as of right is kind of a tricky thing because it, a lot of people think as of right means, kind of like I'm gonna go ahead and do it. I don't care what you say. So there can be a lot of nuance to that. And I mean, that's Dan's world. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Typically with the wetlands permit, I would apply, ENS conditions but on our zoning permit, there's not there. I get pools, houses, and those things are standard. The plan set will usually come with a sheet on the back that shows what their ENS controls will be, and they're typical techniques that are used in building the shed or these kind of things that I don't see where the room is for conditions on a zoning permit, but.
So I haven't been a zoning officer for about 4.5 years, but I was for 12 years. So on the permit form, it may be different from what Stan is using, but I reiterated the size of what I was approving. So if they wanted a 12 by 12 deck, I wrote 12 by 12 deck. And that sort of thing. And if it was a house on a non-conforming lot, I required the as-built, what it was done to show that it met the setbacks, because I wasn't gonna go out and measure based on, you have to be very accurate when it's a non-conforming lot, like the lot is so small. Or if they are trying to maintain their non-conformity setback, meaning they are less than the distance they're supposed to be, or they're very close to the required distance. I had to have them show me that they complied with accuracy from a survey or an as-built. And so I put that as a condition that was required for them to get the CO.
So I guess that sounds almost like a condition.
Yeah, I would say that was the condition, but I didn't have other kinds of conditions.
Okay, and maybe going back to Rich's point of. saying, this is what the applicant is saying that they're planning to do under this zoning permit. How can that be documented? Just as a narrative, as a bullet point that the applicant signs off on, or like Delia did on the zoning permit on the backside saying, all right, the applicant said during the permitting process that they're gonna be this big, they're gonna be this far back, they're gonna have this much space, they're gonna do this, is that. But essentially documenting what the applicant is saying that they're planning to do.
So in our spreadsheet log of this, we keep essentially, as Delia described it, dimension, bed, in-ground pool, with deck. Those kind of descriptions with the dimension. They're not really conditions, they're just, we're
The details
taking
of
them
the
at their,
application.
with the detail they provide.
Then I'll just go one more step. How enforceable is that?
Well, if I could share what I reviewed it, the application form, you have to put down the address, like the property that's going on, and then how far are you putting this thing from the boundary lines? So you put in the setbacks.
Right, right.
Not what we're telling you is the minimum. I want to know where you're putting it.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want it to know if they're gonna build a house and a pool and a deck and a garage all at the same time. I have them list the dimensions of all those things, and then we have the site plan. So then when I go out to do the inspection, I check to see that all those things are the right size and they're in the right place. So sometimes you had people apply for one thing and then build an apartment they didn't have on the list, or add a deck. I wouldn't sign off in the CO until they, if it was a deck, they needed to get a health department approval and then apply for a zoning permit, show that it met the minimum setbacks, meaning it's not too close to the boundary line. And then I could sign off. And if they built their deck and it was too close to the boundary line, they had to take it down. And
I remember you.
I had to deal with one person who kept putting it back up. And I could see it from the road, and he claimed I was trespassing, but I could see it while sitting in my car in the middle of the road. So I'd have to have him take it down, and I drive by it, he put it back up again. And he chose to build the house at the back exact limit of the setback. I'm like, that was your choice. I didn't make you do that. You could have moved it closer to the front. So every time I drive by, and I wasn't doing this on a regular basis, there were other houses that were being built in the neighborhood that I had to do inspections at. I happened to be driving by, I'm like, that deck is back up again.
And how many zoning permits require a CO?
They
Do all of them?
They should all, but it's hard for the zoning officer to know when things are done. So sometimes people haven't called in for the inspection. Because if you had to keep track of everything and go and check in like many days or weeks later, you would never get all your work done because sometimes it's really busy. And I mean, you could have so many permits going on. How would you keep track of the timeline of how many days after you've already approved it? It's their job to call you when they're done.
Okay, I'm trying to
It's a
understand.
physical
The
impossibility.
legal requirement of having a
And they
CO.
also, they can't get
Yeah,
their
you get
CO from the
zoning
building
sign.
official until they get their certificate of zoning compliance from the zoning office.
But I'm
So
sorry, I missed the first part.
If you want to move into your building,
If you move into it, okay, yeah, I understand
the
that.
building
Right.
official, you need them to give you a certificate of occupancy, the CO. But the building official is not allowed to do that until they have the certificate of zoning compliance. So we check different things.
What
So
if
the
it's not
zoning
a
officer,
business? If it's an activity?
then the zoning officer has to check. But sometimes it's hard to know when they've done something, but most of the time, if it's a new use that involved some sort of construction, which is pretty common, then they would need to have that construction signed off by the building official or the fire marshal, and that also would require the CO, the certificate of zoning compliance from the zoning officer.
Was your question more like putting conditions on a use than on a deck or a garage or something like that?
Yes, the use and the scope of the use. And if the scope of the use is described during the application process and a zoning permit is issued for that scope of use. I'm just wondering how to kind of describe it and have the ability to ensure that that scope of use is maintained as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of what I thought you were talking about, where I was saying maybe a letter that says I'm approving this use because, you've,
My zoning permits in the office are not for uses, they're for structures. I think every kind of use has to go through this commission because of the community zone, if it's beyond a home occupation. Or non-residential.
Agricultural.
It's
I guess it wouldn't maybe it wouldn't necessarily be a zoning permit, it would be basically a memo of the file saying that I have reviewed the proposed use, these 8 things that are gonna be done. And you as the CEO would say, and it's my determination that that constitutes a permitted as of right agricultural use. And it should ideally go to the property owner and go in the file so that, if questions come up at some point down the road, wait a minute, what exactly got approved here? It's not a mystery.
If it's a permit, I would think you could do a permit form and detail what it is and where it is. And if you're not approving, if it's not a permit because it's a permitted use, you could just write a letter or the memo or whatever, just stating what it is that you understand is happening and how you made your determination that it is a permitted use or if it needs a permit. And I think the permitted use and it needs a permit is the words are so close, it confuses people. Because permitted sounds like you got your permit.
Yeah, I know. It's like the sign that used to be on Route 3, it said no permitted loads allowed. No, I think that's a good question. I mean, and it's one of those things where, it just comes down to the process, the regulations. Sometimes I think, the regulations might require some kind of, actual documentation, for the use to go into effect. But if if that's not your practice and you just don't have the personnel to do it, it's sort of, not worth creating appearances of something, being done that can't be done, because then it kind of creates the implication that it must be okay because it wasn't done.
Another question.
Yeah, we'll go alphabetically.
Is there a time that a non-compliant applicant can continue being out of compliance, that it ultimately becomes grandfathered, so to speak?
Just structures, not uses. So if you have non-conforming structure that has been located in a particular place for 3 years without formal enforcement action being taken, it's grandfathered. But if you build a barn too close to the road, and have a dance hall in it, the fact that a barn in the wrong location has been there for 3 years and nobody's done anything about it means the barn stays there. But I don't think you can be grandfathered for an illegal or non-conforming use or activity within the structure.
And does things like a notice of violation, is that considered an enforcement action? Or is that it?
I think there was a case a number of years ago that seemed to imply you had to do something more than just mail a letter saying, please move your shed, please take your deck down. Because actually, when that was going on, I was tricked into representing one of our secretaries who had a problem because they had a house and they had a garage, and her boyfriend basically built a connector between the house and the garage. And it didn't have a foundation, it's just kind of like curtain walls, but the town building inspector really didn't like the guy for a variety of reasons, so he was just harassing him about that. And literally during the time that we were arguing back and forth about, you know, this, because it was, the violation at that point was there was too much lot coverage between the house, the garage, and he was claiming that this, you know, connecting breezeway was also a structure, you know, that was enclosed and created, you know, it was like 24% lot coverage or something like that, because it was a small lot on the corner in a highly visible location. While we were arguing back and forth about that, the case came down that said essentially, you know, notices of violation, cease and desist letters weren't enough. You actually had to start a civil action to make it go away. And, you know, we sent them a copy of the case and they were like, oh yeah, you're just right.
So if an applicant manages to delay things for a long time. Or to do something other than for legal action.
The use doesn't get grandfathered, but the structure sounds like the,
Yeah.
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 Yeah, the structure.
So an activity can't get grandfathered.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not entitled to protection.
in his example, the walkway or whatever is still for the residential use. It's a residential property.
Right.
It wasn't a different use for that walkway compared to the house and garage.
I think more commercial.
Right, but I was just using his example. It's the same use.
Can I clarify one more thing? Article 4, I just want to make sure I understand it correctly, that in our regulation, with like regulations, if something is not, if an activity is not specifically allowed, then it's prohibited. Is that an accurate statement?
I think so.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's how most regulations are written these days. I remember the town that I live on, when I first got on planning and zoning, we had the 1954 regulations, which had extremely long lists of things that were prohibited. You know, like aluminum refineries and, you know, alabaster factories and, you know.
Nuclear waste depository.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and it became virtually impossible to find modern uses on those lists. And, you know, just basically trying to keep ahead of everything you want to prohibit. You know, you just basically had to keep thinking of, all right, what are kids doing these days that we want to prohibit? So when we redid them, it kind of reverted the other way, and most places have, you know, they're permissive, meaning that, you know, it tells you what you can do, and if it's not listed, you have to get a variance or it's prohibited.
And that's where petitions come in to change the language of the regulations. If somebody wants something to do in a town, then they come in and ask to have something added to that list of permitted uses.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, there's one situation I can think of where, you know, a particular sort of innocuous commercial use is being relocated. The building that they have been in is being sold and they're going to be different tenants. They found an ideal location somewhere else, but it's in a different zone that doesn't specifically allow that. So they're, you know, amending the regulations to allow that particular innocuous commercial use in the second zone. So that's how that would go.
Thank you.
So if our regulations don't specifically say, for instance, you can sell cannabis or you can raise cannabis, would we need to have regulations on cannabis?
Well, that's probably not a good example because the legislature has done that work for you. They said that essentially that if you don't have regulations that either prohibit or regulate or allow it, it has to be treated like the most similar use. And so that kind of prompted a whole bunch of discussion as to, well, what's a similar use to a cannabis dispensary? You know, and if you have regulations for like a medical dispensary, that obviously would be a relatively similar use, but you know, people have been all over the lot saying, well, it could be a drugstore, it could be a package store, it could be any kind of retail, you know, as the comparable use that you have to regulate it like. So the legislation basically forces you to either, you know, roll the dice that you have a CEO who isn't going to go crazy, or you figure out how if at all you want to regulate it or prohibit it. But I think, you know, picking anything other than that, your question is a fair one, which is, you know, internet sales. I mean, when you write the zoning regulations in 1995, nobody has anything in there for internet sales. So quite often in the list of uses or at the end of it, it'll say something like, you know, for any use not listed in here, you know, again, you know, a comparable use may be substituted or something like that, so that you know, you kind of try to find something like it and figure out, is that permitted in this zone and that sort of thing. So if you have kind of a, you know, a comparable basket provision in your regulations, it saves you from having to, you know, go back and come up with a new list of permitted activities every year.
I have a question about enforcement of, if you've exhausted all the other letters and notices to somebody that they haven't complied. Are we authorized to or allowed to specify a certain monetary amount per day of a fine for non-compliance? And how hard is that to enforce?
The statute allows him to do that.
I think if it's in our language, in our zoning document, that we should reference the fine per day. But ultimately, we would need a judgment. It's kind of how it's always worked out, and I don't think that fine amount ever comes back in any meaningful way.
Well, sometimes it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I mean, like what happened with Delia. She had to keep going back and to this same landowner time after time after time. That cost us money.
Yeah.
And so we could show actual damages to the town, you know, to the tune of $150 a day or whatever.
yeah, there are basically two ways to enforce zoning and other regulations. The statute allows the zoning enforcement officer to go to court and to seek, you know, daily fines for continued violations. And, you know, you have to, it costs money to go to court and start the whole thing up, and it's not the quickest process in the world to, you know, particularly nowadays to get anything processed. But if you have, you know, if you have a situation and an offender who isn't willing to, you know, comply in any other way, you know, you can start that process. And you know, we've had situations where we've gotten, you know, 5- and 6-figure judgments against people for, you know, continued violations. And, you know, if they don't pay it, you just put a lien on the property for the amount of the judgment and the costs and so forth. The alternative is that a lot of towns have kind of the citation ordinances, which is basically like zoning tickets. You know, that's a whole different process. It it isn't front loaded with going to court. It's more, paperwork, I find you in violation, $100 a day. A few days later, a week later, you go back and see the same situation, exists, issue another notice, violation, the fines are continuing to rack up. And then, you just basically follow the statutory citation process until it gets to the point where the person has the opportunity for a hearing. They usually, half the time they'll come to the hearing and say, oh, I didn't know, can you give me a break? And, the hearing officer is usually some resident of town who kind of is like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll give you a break and, wipe out the fines or cut them in half or something like that. But on the other hand, there are hearing officers who say, no, you're continuing to, to violate. Frankly, the most likely outcome is the person's just going to blow it off and not even, call for the hearing, in which case, as long as the violation continues, the citations and the dollar amounts continue to accumulate. And when it gets to the point where you're not, where you want to kind of show you're serious about it, then you go to court to basically have all of the citations reduced to a judgment. And again, you can put that on the property and, and collect it at some point. But, I think both of those things are when you have somebody who just really is, completely obstinate about not wanting to comply.
Woodstock did consider a finding ordinance. I can't remember which first selectman it was, but we looked into it and we were told they needed to have an appeals board and they couldn't figure out who would be on the appeals board.
Well, it's a hearing officer. You
Yeah,
just,
they couldn't find one who would do that because they thought there was limitations on who could be that person.
well, it can't be a town official.
They just gave up on the idea.
It doesn't, and this appeals board barely meets, and sometimes I've seen it written where it could be as needed.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely as needed. I mean, it's after somebody's had the citations, thrown at them and they say, yeah, I want a hearing so I can tell my side of the story about, how I'm not violating the zoning ordinance. People don't do that very often. But,
The appeals officer, I've heard people are kind of wonder about that aspect of it, but I think it's a very simple.
Well, at the time, whoever the first selectman was didn't want to go through that.
Yep.
Yeah.
But
Well, it would have to be a town meeting to adopt that ordinance, and that could be contentious.
So that, Rich, you were saying that the statute allows the CEO to impose fines, but it has to be preceded by a town ordinance that establishes that?
no, the two paths are the CEO can just go do it on his own under the statute and go to court. Or the town can adopt the citation ordinance where you're basically handing out the zoning tickets and the,
Okay,
then you have the hearing process.
does the commission need to establish that fine structure that the CEO can impose?
It would be in the ordinance. The first one is in the statute. Tells you how many dollars.
Oh, there is something in Connecticut general statute.
Yeah, I think it's 812 or 812.
Okay,
It's a local enabling statute.
No, it's a general statute that allows you to do that. Yeah, you don't need to be permitted by the town to do that. You have that authority. It's the citation one
Okay.
that needs to be created by the town.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, and I've heard the hearing officer situation both sides. It was, there was one town where I think it was like 3 older retired women were the hearing officers and they felt bad for everybody, and all of the citations got dismissed, so they just sort of gave up on it. And then the other one, it was like the retired tree warden who was pining for authority, and was just really excited to have a new opportunity to stick it to people. So he was, upholding every citation.
Most of,
Sometimes the citation brings the person to the table. And
Okay.
the ultimate goal is compliance. Usually, I mean, in Windsor Locks, we had a local ordinance that we use to do lean and clean with our blight program. And we were highly effective with that. We didn't ever have to use it against a person with a name on the property card. We used it against LLCs, out-of-state property owners that neglected their property and caused others around them to feel that they could just let their stuff go too. When we effectively targeted these state properties that were neglected, the community transformed around it. So I think they're useful, targeted. You don't want to go to war with your community.
Right.
But I think we were able to accomplish those fines, lean and clean. The check would come a few months later. After we performed our mowing or towing or whatnot. And we released the lien as soon as we got the check, and they would stay, right after that. But it was contentious to adopt that local ordinance that allowed them to fine.
Yeah, because, I mean, basically, once you get the citation ordinance, you can use that to. The citation process you can use to enforce any town ordinance, and quite often it's a blight ordinance that goes with it, unregistered motor vehicles. Just essentially something other than trying to find somebody from Troop D to give out a ticket for a town ordinance, which is never gonna happen.
Right.
The other thing too is that with the citations, I mean, it's within the town's discretion to decide whether or not to reduce them to a judgment. So, if you've got the person's attention, they come into compliance, you have some flexibility on it. It's like, all right, we'll let this go, as opposed to, no, I want my $2,850 for, for the pain and suffering of having to send out letters.
I think the only thing that I'm familiar with in Woodstock is a fine or a house trailer beyond the 1 year or 2 year from temporary use of the trailer or the property. I'm looking to Dan or Delia to see.
I haven't really been able to work with much with the trailer ordinance, but I know there is one.
There is
There's
a
a
trailer
form.
ordinance. Okay.
There is a process.
Yeah.
There's probably 100 out there and no capacity to really address that with those.
No, I was looking for that. I was just thinking that's the only vehicle that I'm aware of in the town that imposes a fine, as a fine, other than what I'm just hearing now about Connecticut
I
General
was a zoning
statutes
officer.
allowing a CEO to do those fines.
When I was a zoning officer, I didn't use the fines because the town didn't want to go that route.
Right.
But I had a handful of junk properties, junkyards,
Yes, yeah,
and it took a lot of patience, but I went out there repeatedly and I met with people and got them to clean it up. It just took a lot of time. And I often wasn't gonna go there by myself because some of these people were.
rambunctious.
No, they were
They were
Either-
residents.
someone you wouldn't trust yourself alone with them.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
trust them to be when you're alone. Or someone was on the sex offender list.
Yeah.
And they were reported to have a gun, and there was
Yeah.
someone else who was trying to expose himself to me all the time, and so I was gonna go to these properties by myself, so it took multiple town employees, and one of them, we had the health department and the building official, and there were people living in trailers without waste disposal, and it was going on the ground, and they had junk everywhere. But eventually it got them cleaned up.
Were you able, I know you didn't, but were you allowed to impose a fine? At that, if you wanted to?
I think you could.
I didn't know about the being able to do it, but the
Okay.
town didn't want to go through
Yeah,
the other process. And so I would send my letters and I would meet with them and get them to keep going and clean it up. And they all got cleaned up, the ones that I was involved in.
Yeah, I think the wetlands enforcement one is the one with the biggest fines, actually.
And we have, the town of Woodstock has a fine structure for the wetlands.
That's statutory too.
That's statutory. Okay.
Might be in the regulations, but I think it's statutory.
I think it's in the regulations, but I haven't had to look to that page yet.
No, I mean, and I think any town ordinance that's violated, if you wanted to use the citation ordinance process, you can do it. You know, I haven't looked through the list lately, but I mean, there are a lot of kind of obsolete ordinances that, probably say $15 fine or $25 fine or so forth. But you could use the same procedure to enforce those, and I think we have the nuclear waste one. So if somebody violated that, it could issue tickets.
$15 for that. but-
Yeah.
Up to 22.
Could you reiterate some of the new training requirements for the land use commissioners? ZBA, PCC would need to meet per calendar year.
Okay. Well, we've gotten 1 hour. Yeah, it's essentially anybody on planning and zoning or the ZBA has to, during this calendar year, have 4 hours of training, one of which has to be on fair and affordable housing. And there are multiple opportunities out there to get that training. The day-long bar association thing, I think, would have gotten you both of those, both the 4 and the 1. UConn's Center for Land Use Education and Research, Land Use Academy has somewhere on their page, they have links to 3 different videos that will cumulatively give you 4.5 hours, including, I think,
It's
probably-
probably credit.
yeah, well, I think it's an hour and a quarter on fair and affordable housing. Because the first 15 minutes were him trying to figure out how to share the screen. So they cut that off, but it's at least an hour of substance on fair and affordable housing, so that at least at this point, it's kind of on the honor principle, and you say you watched it. There's trying to remember, it was on the planners listserv. There was another thing sent around just a couple days ago about another kind of webinar video sort of thing that you can watch that, would get you the hour. Yeah, so it's essentially sometime during 2023, you get 4 hours of either live or, online training.
And then how do you show that you've done it? Is someone gonna ask for a report from each town to know whether the commission members have done this?
Each commission is supposed to report to the legislative body, or if it's a town meeting, the Board of Selectmen by, I think it's March 1st of next year, indicating whether people have complied or not. It doesn't say what happens if you don't. But, at least that step of it is in there so that, there is documentary requirement. Again, I think at this point, everybody's kind of on their honor. If you want to keep the certificates and turn them in, go ahead.
So for our commissions, I've been keeping the brochure of and logging on our roster who's taken advantage of that training opportunity, as I'm aware. I think Tracy might have sent out, if she hasn't, she will be doing so, a request for everybody to report if they've taken any training. And I know we have the roster all prepared for everybody's responses, and
Does this count?
Yes.
we, Rich said, there was one on the listserv the other day. I think it was a Tuesday afternoon, affordable housing, Robinson and Cole.
I think so.
I had Tracy send that opportunity around. It's like a Tuesday from 4 to 6. Kind of weird, but if anybody could make that, I know that will count a little bit towards the affordable housing. And I'm starting to see on the listserv and other areas, these types of opportunities popping up more often to accommodate the state's desire to get everybody fully trained.
Is there a website or anything that you can go to that lists these things that you can
Yes,
click on and open to?
we can click the link.
Yeah, I think the Yukon Clear website was also, in addition to posting the things that you can just kind of click on and, you know, sit in your hammock and watch. You know, also kind of a clearinghouse of other, you know, upcoming sessions and so forth, maybe in person or online or so forth.
Well, I know I have to do one for burning official every 5 years. I have, and it's like a 40-hour thing. It's kind of crazy. They tell you can do it in like 2 or 3 hours. It's like, yeah, that's a joke. It takes quite a while. It takes me, you know, most of the afternoon, you know, to do this thing, you know. So, when you're all done, there's a printout to say that you did it. I have to submit that to the town, the DEP, to say that I did it. I have to pass a certain grade, all this kind of stuff. So also,
Yeah,
it seems though there should be some sort of certificate that says that proves that you actually did that.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the program, they do have some of those. It's like when people were watching those 3 that have been recorded, when they were watching them live, they kept track of everybody. You know, and I think they all got emails saying, yeah, you were here for 84 minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the, you know, I don't think they've come up with any kind of formal way of verifying anything. It just seems like, you know, particularly since it's taking longer to roll out the opportunities than I think people had anticipated. You know, it seems kind of overkill to be too draconian on making sure that you prove every minute of, you know.
Essentially regulation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like so many of these things where you have to like keep hitting the space bar or enter a code every 20 minutes to prove that you're still there.
Perhaps, I think in this first year that they're just hoping for some reporting to gauge how the legislation, how at least some communities, some samples of some communities have responded to the legislation and how to tinker it accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned at some point, probably 2 years ago when we were here, that the original version of the legislation made it mandatory and that if you hadn't satisfied the requirements, that you couldn't participate in meetings. And, you know, I was kind of involved in working on it. I said, that's not gonna work. I said, you know, you have a lot of towns where the ZBA meets twice a year for a half hour. Somebody has to go through 4 hours of mandatory training so that they can do an hour of volunteer work during the course of the year. You know, it's like you're never going to have anyone ever get a variance again because you won't have 4 people in every town who are just going to put up with it. So, you know, the mandatory aspect of it kind of got dropped. And it's also every other year, so that if you do it this year, you're good for next year, and then, you know, every 2 years after that, you have to do the 4. But I mean, if you want to do, you know, 2 hours in the next year and 2 hours the year after that, it seems like that should do it.
Do you think there would be a more formal credential, like a wetland certification for zoning commissioners, or?
I think it really depends on how well someone steps up with a program. Because the initial fear was, you know, we've got 169 towns with 168 zoning commissions, you know, and ZBAs, and, you know, they all have between 5 and 12 members who need this. You know, how is this training going to get delivered to this large diffuse population. And so the way it was, the way it was written and the way OPM put out the guidelines, it was very broad in terms of, who was eligible to provide the training. It was, the zoning enforcement officers, the planning association, the bar association, UConn, the COGS, lawyers. So there wasn't like a certification requirement for who it was that was providing the training, so.
And it was left open-ended. I think it referred to other organizations like the ones that were just previously referenced.
Yeah.
The Connecticut Land Conservation Council had an affordable housing and conservation intersection discussion, and that CLCC isn't on the list, but it was a comparable affordable housing training opportunity.
Yeah,
And I think if we find these kind of things, we can, in the absence of fully defined certifying process, I think we could just make note of it and try to achieve as much training as we can. That's being put up to offer. But the listserv is a good source, but UConn Clear has the easy ones to do online in your own time. It's not, you don't need it to log it to a live webinar. That's all.
yeah, I mean, and the, the plan or the idea was, to create kind of a consistent curriculum and to have that offered through the COGS, so that, people wouldn't have to drive to, Hartford or Haddam or wherever, that, you could have 5, 6, 7 towns, have the opportunity, we're doing it in Putnam tonight, come on down. We'll get you 2 hours, that sort of thing, but almost all of the people at UConn who were involved in it at the beginning have retired. And it's essentially Dave Dixon is, they're just kind of trying to keep all the plates spinning while they look for other people to work there.
We got an uptick in applications in the past week.
What?
Go to UConn.
Oh,
And Quinnipiac.
That's true. Yep. Anybody, yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions or anything else for Rich?
Dwight, do you have any questions? We lost Doug, but Dwight's still there.
Yeah, I guess Doug signed off. No, I really don't. I've just been kind of listening here.
Want to cover Rich?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Hopefully next year I'll either have some fascinating new legislation to warn you about, or put together something to provide you with another hour of education.
Well, thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Attorney Roberts. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, it's sometimes better when people just kind of ask whatever questions or talk about whatever comes to mind, rather than having the artificial program of things that we may have already talked about.
Agenda item. Move to adjourn. Second. Motion by Tim Young, seconded by David Morris. All in favor? Just the ayes have it.
Oh, wait a minute, you have to go do a voice vote for Dwight. Because it's.
Dwight, you still there?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, you only have to take a roll call if it's not unanimous.
Excellent.
Oh, I thought
That's it.
there was a roll call because we were doing.
We done, we.
Only if it's not
Motion got
unanimous.
approved?
Motion's approved, yeah.